Wednesday morning, a federal courtroom in Washington went from procedural to combustible in less than 2 minutes. A sitting judge, reviewing sworn testimony line by line, stopped mid-exchange and asked a question that changed the temperature of the room instantly. The court had before it 2 records: testimony given under oath and documentary evidence submitted days earlier by the Attorney General's office. According to the transcript, the judge held them side by side and said, "These statements cannot both be accurate." What followed was not political theater. It was procedural escalation. Within minutes, the court ordered restraint pending clarification, instructing federal marshals to stand by while counsel attempted to reconcile what the record now showed. Sworn testimony in federal court is not campaign speech. It is not press rhetoric. It is not social media commentary. When a witness takes an oath, the legal standard shifts entirely. Every answer becomes part of an evidentiary record that can trigger contempt exposure, referral for perjury review, or immediate enforcement measures if the court believes the integrity of the proceeding is at risk. That is the context in which this moment unfolded. The issue was not tone, it was contradiction. According to filings entered earlier in the week, the Attorney General's office had produced documentation that appeared to directly conflict with specific statements made under oath. The documents were time-stamped, authenticated, and submitted through formal channels. They were not anonymous leaks or speculative summaries. They were part of the official court record. And when the judge reviewed them against prior sworn answers, the gap was not subtle, it was material. That is where the tension begins. Was this an intentional deception? A deliberate attempt to mislead the court in a high-stakes proceeding? Or was it a misinterpretation? A semantic conflict amplified by the adversarial nature of federal litigation? Defense counsel argued that context mattered. Prosecutors insisted that clarity mattered more. The judge, facing 2 irreconcilable versions of events, made a procedural decision designed to preserve control of the courtroom and the credibility of the process. Handcuffs in a federal courtroom are not symbolic. They represent judicial authority enforcing compliance. Whether temporary or extended, restraint signals that the court believes the integrity of the proceeding may be compromised. And that is precisely what makes this moment significant. Not because of who was involved, but because of what was at stake: the reliability of sworn testimony measured against documentary proof. In federal court, when those 2 collide, escalation is not optional. It is built into the system itself. To understand how the courtroom reached that point, you have to rewind several weeks. The underlying proceeding was not a criminal trial, but a federal compliance review tied to sworn disclosures previously submitted to an oversight body. The court had scheduled a structured evidentiary session to determine whether prior representations met statutory requirements. It was procedural, technical, and until recently, relatively controlled. There had been disputes, yes, but nothing that suggested immediate enforcement action. The turning point began with testimony delivered under oath during an earlier hearing. During that session, specific assertions were made about communications, documentation, and internal approvals connected to the matter under review. Those answers were recorded in the official transcript and entered into the court's docket. At the time, no immediate objection triggered escalation. The testimony stood as part of the evolving record. Several days later, however, the Attorney General's office submitted a supplemental filing. According to the docket, the submission included authenticated records that had not previously been produced. The filing was not framed as an accusation. It was labeled as documentary clarification, responsive to the court's standing request for complete disclosure. Embedded within that production were materials that appeared to conflict directly with portions of the earlier sworn testimony. The court received the filing late in the week. By Monday, the judge had ordered both parties to be prepared to address the supplemental documentation at the next open session. That instruction alone signaled the court believed the materials were consequential. Still, no enforcement discussion was formally scheduled. The proceeding remained classified as a compliance review with potential contempt exposure if deficiencies persisted, not as a perjury hearing. Tuesday's session opened routinely. Counsel for both sides were present. The transcript reflects standard procedural exchanges before the judge pivoted to the newly submitted exhibits. Page references were cited. Statements from the prior testimony were read back into the record. Then came the comparison. The judge placed the earlier sworn answers alongside the documentary entries produced by Bondi's office and asked counsel to reconcile them. It was at that precise moment the atmosphere shifted. The discrepancy was no longer theoretical or confined to written briefs. It was articulated in open court, on the record, in real time. The judge characterized the contradiction as material, meaning it went to the substance of the compliance question rather than peripheral detail. Defense counsel requested a brief recess to review the cited pages. Prosecutors maintained that the documents spoke for themselves. What appeared outwardly as a sudden escalation was, in reality, procedural accumulation. Testimony had been given. Documentation had been filed. The court had reviewed both independently. Only after that layered sequence did the discrepancy surface publicly. By the time the judge identified the inconsistency aloud, the groundwork had already been laid through weeks of filings and formal exchanges. And that buildup is what made the next step feel less like chaos and more like a court confronting its own record. The conflict centered on two specific portions of the record. First, testimony given under oath during the earlier compliance session. According to the transcript, page 142, line 18 through page 143, line 6, the witness stated, "No written authorization was issued and no external communication occurred beyond the disclosed memorandum." That statement was clear, categorical, and unqualified. It became part of the official evidentiary record the moment it was spoken. Then came the supplemental filing from the Attorney General's office. In Exhibit 7B, attached to the motion entered 3 days later, prosecutors included what they described as authenticated correspondence. Page 12 of that exhibit contained an email chain referencing a written authorization dated within the same time frame addressed in the testimony. Page 19 included a transmittal log reflecting external distribution beyond the disclosed memorandum. The timestamps aligned precisely with the period covered by the sworn answers. That is where the legal significance emerges. When testimony is given under oath in federal court, it is subject to 18 U.S.C. Section 1621, the federal perjury statute, which requires proof that a witness knowingly made a materially false statement about a fact relevant to the proceeding. Materiality does not require the statement to decide the entire case. It only needs to have the capacity to influence the tribunal. Alternatively, inconsistent sworn testimony can also expose a party to contempt under the court's inherent authority if the contradiction obstructs or undermines the integrity of the process. During Tuesday's session, the judge cited the transcript pages directly and referenced Exhibit 7B by number. The court stated, "The record reflects a sworn denial of written authorization, yet Exhibit 7B contains a document bearing that description within the same operative dates." The emphasis was not rhetorical, it was procedural. Federal courts treat documentary contradictions seriously because written evidence, especially when authenticated, carries independent evidentiary weight. This was not treated as a minor discrepancy because the statements were categorical, not ambiguous. If the documents are verified as authentic and contemporaneous, the court must determine whether the sworn answer was inaccurate, incomplete, or knowingly false, and that determination is not optional. Once the inconsistency appears on the record, the court has an obligation to address it directly. What happened next is where interpretation begins to diverge from the record. Contrary to dramatic retellings, the judge did not leap from contradiction to punishment in a single breath. The transcript reflects a structured progression. After identifying the inconsistency between sworn testimony and Exhibit 7B, the court asked defense counsel directly whether there was an immediate explanation. When counsel requested additional time to review the documents, the judge granted a brief recess. Only after that recess concluded without a substantive clarification did the court move to enforcement. The order was not phrased as a final finding of perjury. Instead, the judge invoked the court's inherent authority to maintain the integrity of ongoing proceedings. The directive instructed the United States Marshals Service to stand by and implement temporary restraint, pending further clarification of the record. In federal practice, that kind of action is often categorized as a contempt hold or custodial detention to ensure compliance and prevent obstruction while material discrepancies are examined. It is not by itself a criminal conviction. It is a procedural safeguard. When observers describe the moment as snapping handcuffs, they are referring to the physical manifestation of judicial authority. Marshals execute court orders. If the judge determines that the integrity of the proceeding may be compromised by unresolved material contradictions, the court has the authority to impose temporary custody. This can serve several purposes: ensuring appearance at subsequent hearings, preventing interference with evidence, or reinforcing that sworn testimony cannot be treated casually. The optics are dramatic, but the mechanism is embedded in long-standing federal procedure. Judges rarely escalate to physical enforcement without layered thresholds being crossed. First, a material inconsistency must be identified. Second, counsel must be given an opportunity to reconcile it. Third, the court must determine that the discrepancy has direct bearing on the proceeding. According to the transcript, the judge stated, "The integrity of this court's record is paramount. Until the discrepancy is resolved, the court will act to preserve it." That language reflects methodical reasoning rather than emotional reaction. The central question now becomes whether this escalation was legally inevitable once the contradiction surfaced, or whether it moved more aggressively than necessary given the context. Defense counsel is expected to argue that additional time and briefing would have sufficed. Prosecutors will likely maintain that the categorical nature of the sworn denial, paired with contemporaneous documentation, left the court little choice. What is clear is that the judge framed the decision not as punishment, but as preservation of judicial authority, and that framing will shape what happens next. What most coverage has overlooked is not the contradiction itself, but what gave the judge confidence that it was not isolated. Exhibit 7B was not the only document cited during the session. Buried in the supplemental filing was a certification page signed by a records custodian attesting to the completeness and authenticity of the production. That certification matters. It elevates the evidentiary weight of the documents beyond simple submission and signals that the Attorney General's office was prepared to defend the integrity of the record if challenged. There was also timing. The supplemental filing was entered 3 days after testimony, not weeks later. That proximity reduces the likelihood that the discrepancy resulted from a shifting factual landscape. The judge referenced this directly, noting that the documents bore timestamps predating the sworn denial and were maintained within the same institutional record system described during testimony. In other words, the contradiction was not between two competing narratives from different sources. It was between a sworn statement and the witness's own institutional paper trail. Another layer often missed is compliance history. Earlier in the proceeding, the court had issued a standing order requiring complete and continuous disclosure of responsive materials. While no formal finding of noncompliance had been entered before this moment, the transcript reflects that the judge reminded counsel of prior warnings about precision in sworn answers. That reminder did not accuse anyone of misconduct, but it established context. Federal judges build records incrementally. They document instructions, clarify obligations, and note deviations. By the time enforcement is considered, the groundwork has usually been laid across multiple hearings. One detail receiving little attention is a footnote in the government's filing referencing a secondary exhibit under seal. Though not discussed extensively in open court, the judge acknowledged reviewing it in chambers. While its contents remain undisclosed, the acknowledgement suggests the court's conclusion did not rest on a single email chain alone. Judges rarely anchor escalation on one document if corroboration exists elsewhere in the docket. This layered foundation is what distinguishes procedural escalation from reactive discipline. When the judge stated that the inconsistency was material and unresolved, it followed weeks of documented exchanges, standing disclosure obligations, and authenticated filings. The enforcement order may have appeared sudden to observers, but from the bench's perspective, it was the culmination of a record carefully constructed over time. That nuance matters because it informs whether the action is viewed as measured judicial stewardship or disproportionate response. And that distinction is exactly where the fairness debate now begins. To evaluate this development objectively, the defense's perspective must be examined with equal analytical weight. The defense's core argument centers on interpretation rather than deception. They maintain that the alleged contradiction is not proof of intentional falsehood, but a semantic discrepancy amplified by the adversarial nature of the proceeding. From their viewpoint, the phrase written authorization carries a specific formal legal meaning that differs from the informal preparatory email correspondence produced by the Attorney General's office. If the witness understood the question as referencing a finalized, executed directive, then a denial of its existence is factually defensible, even if preliminary communications were occurring simultaneously. Furthermore, defense counsel raised significant due process concerns regarding the timing and completeness of the document production. They argued that Bondi's office introduced Exhibit 7B with minimal advance notice, depriving the defense of a meaningful opportunity to conduct a comprehensive privilege review or authenticate the files independently. Under federal procedure, a witness cannot be expected to reconcile complex documentary trails in real time without adequate preparation. To elevate an unresolved discrepancy into an immediate enforcement action, the defense argues, bypasses standard evidentiary hearings, and sets a problematic precedent for how courts handle fast-moving compliance disputes. Constitutional scholars have also noted that the legal threshold for proving perjury or intentional deception is exceptionally high. A simple inaccuracy, a memory lapse, or a differing interpretation of a question does not automatically constitute a federal offense. Courts must establish that the declarant knowingly and willfully made a false statement with the specific intent to deceive the tribunal. Legal analysts point out that contemporaneous documentary conflicts occur regularly in complex litigation without triggering custodial restraint or contempt holds. The defense contends that the court's rapid escalation was procedurally aggressive, transforming a standard interpretive debate into an unnecessary spectacle. However, while these defensive arguments are grounded in established due process principles, observers point out that they face a steep climb against the prosecution's documented timeline. The Attorney General's filing presented authenticated, time-stamped records that appeared to directly cover the substance of the sworn denial. When a witness offers categorical, absolute statements under oath rather than qualified answers, the legal margin for error shrinks significantly. The contrast between these two arguments represents the central tension of the case. Whether the discrepancy reflects a genuine semantic misunderstanding or a documented failure of candor. How the court ultimately resolves this tension carries implications that extend far beyond the boundaries of this specific proceeding. Beyond the personalities involved, this moment signals something larger about how federal courts are approaching sworn testimony in high-profile proceedings. Judicial tolerance for material contradictions has always been limited, but in cases involving executive figures or nationally visible defendants, the scrutiny intensifies. Courts are acutely aware that public confidence in the legal system depends on the perception that the rules apply evenly. When sworn testimony appears to conflict with documentary evidence, the judiciary faces a choice: treat it as routine litigation friction or confront it decisively to preserve institutional credibility. This escalation suggests that federal judges may be less willing to allow unresolved discrepancies to linger, particularly when the testimony in question goes to the heart of compliance obligations. Oversight mechanisms function only if disclosures under oath are reliable. If courts signal that contradictions can be postponed indefinitely through procedural maneuvering, the deterrent value of sworn testimony diminishes. By acting swiftly, even if temporarily, the judge reinforced the principle that the integrity of the record outweighs reputational or political considerations. For high-profile defendants, the implications are significant. Public visibility does not dilute evidentiary standards. If anything, it sharpens them. Future proceedings involving executive officials may reference this episode as an example of how courts can assert authority when documentation and testimony diverge. It may also encourage more precise questioning and more carefully qualified answers under oath, reducing the risk of categorical denials that later collide with paper trails. At a structural level, this episode reflects ongoing tension between executive power and judicial oversight. Federal courts are designed to operate independently of political branches, yet they must frequently adjudicate disputes involving those very institutions. When contradictions surface, enforcement decisions become symbolic as well as procedural. The judiciary's willingness to act affirms its role as guardian of the evidentiary record, even in cases involving prominent figures. Ultimately, enforcement credibility sustains institutional legitimacy. If courts hesitate to confront inconsistencies for fear of controversy, confidence erodes. Conversely, if they overreach without sufficient foundation, legitimacy suffers in another direction. The balance is delicate, and moments like this test where that equilibrium truly lies. The immediate question now is not what happened in the courtroom, but what happens next. The judge's order for temporary restraint was not a final determination of perjury or contempt. It was a preservation measure. The next procedural steps will determine whether the contradiction identified on the record evolves into a formal finding or dissipates under further scrutiny. First, defense counsel is expected to file an emergency motion challenging the custodial enforcement order. That motion will likely argue that the restraint exceeded the court's authority absent a separate evidentiary hearing. Under federal procedure, contempt findings, particularly those involving potential incarceration, typically require notice and an opportunity to be heard. If the defense frames the action as punitive rather than preservative, appellate review could be triggered quickly. The appellate clock, once activated, moves on compressed timelines in cases involving custodial status. Second, the district court may schedule a focused evidentiary hearing to examine the authenticity, scope, and interpretation of Exhibit 7B and any related documents referenced under seal. At that hearing, both sides would have the opportunity to question records custodians, clarify terminology, and establish whether the sworn denial was materially inaccurate or contextually defensible. That process matters. It shifts the conversation from optics to proof. Third, the court could consider referring the matter to the Department of Justice for independent evaluation under the federal perjury statute if it determines there is sufficient basis to believe a knowing falsehood occurred. Such referrals are rare, but not unprecedented. They signal that the issue extends beyond compliance and into potential criminal exposure. However, referral decisions often follow careful deliberation rather than immediate reaction. Observers should also watch the language used in any written order issued in the coming days. Judges frequently clarify oral rulings with detailed written explanations. If the written order emphasizes preservation of the record and procedural safeguards, it may strengthen the court's position against appellate challenge. If, instead, it adopts accusatory phrasing suggesting conclusions about intent, the defense will likely seize on that tone in higher courts. The central issue moving forward is durability. Does the contradiction withstand adversarial testing? Can the defense reconcile the sworn statement with authenticated documentation in a way that satisfies judicial scrutiny? Or does further examination deepen the inconsistency rather than resolve it? Deadlines are already forming. Motions may be filed within 48 hours. Appellate briefs could follow within days. A hearing date, if set, will anchor the next phase of this dispute. Each procedural step narrows the range of outcomes. The court's next written order, the defense's next filing, and any appellate response will collectively determine whether this episode remains a temporary compliance flashpoint or becomes a defining test of sworn testimony standards in high-profile federal proceedings.